At 3 minutes past 10 in the morning on June 19, 1944, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu sat in a cockpit that trembled like it was alive. On the deck of the USS Lexington, the launch officer was chopping the air with his arms, then jabbing a finger toward a patch of sky that looked far too busy for comfort. Out over the Pacific, the breeze no longer carried the clean bite of salt water. Now it reeked of aviation gasoline and raw fear. In the headset of every pilot waiting to launch, the radio traffic had dissolved into overlapping shouts that sounded unreal. Down below, the radar crews were not calling out a formation or even a squadron. They were describing a dense mass that swallowed half the screen, a moving storm of static racing in at 300 miles per hour. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, in command of the Japanese fleet, had just gambled everything on one throw. He had launched nearly every aircraft he could put in the air. Anything with a propeller and a red sun on its wings was climbing hard and heading straight for the American ships. Estimates said roughly 450 enemy planes were on the way. No naval battle had ever seen a single strike force that large. Between that airborne armada and the fleet below sat Vraciu in his Grumman Hellcat, an airplane that growled and clattered like farm machinery chewing through scrap metal. His engine did not just sound unhealthy, it sounded furious. The big Pratt & Whitney radial up front was already spitting oil. Thick drops streaked across the canopy, smearing his view with a greasy film that shimmered in rainbow colors before he had even released the brakes. The supercharger, the device that let the engine breathe at altitude, rattled and knocked inside its housing. According to every line in the Navy maintenance book, this aircraft should have been locked down. It was a mechanic's nightmare, a risk no one was supposed to take. To many, it looked like a coffin with wings. Vraciu ignored the book. Over the past day, he had been fighting a different battle, not against the Japanese, but against his own ground crew, just to get this particular Hellcat armed the way he wanted and placed on the catapult. That struggle had started the previous evening, deep inside the hot, steel interior of the Lexington. While other pilots relaxed with cards, smoked their last cigarettes of the day, or wrote careful letters home, Vraciu had gone below to the armory yet again. He was pestering the ordnance crew. Around the squadron, they thought he was strange. Behind his back they called him the Janitor, not because he scrubbed decks, but because he obsessed over the greasy details officers were supposed to leave alone. Pilots flew. Enlisted men fixed and loaded. That was the tradition. Vraciu ignored it daily. He stood over stacks of ammunition belts, hands slick with gun oil, arguing with a master chief who had been loading aircraft guns since Vraciu was a child. Their dispute was about ammunition. Standard Navy fighter belts followed a formula: 2 armor-piercing rounds, 1 incendiary, and 1 tracer. It was a balanced mix meant to handle most situations. The armor-piercing rounds could punch through metal, the incendiary might start a fire, and the tracer let a pilot see where his shots were going. The Navy liked it because it was predictable and easy to supply. Vraciu could not stand it. He stared at the belt like it was a cold meal he had been forced to eat before. "I do not want tracers," he told the chief. The older man closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead. They had argued about this more than once. Tracers were the glowing rounds that showed a pilot his line of fire. Taking them out was like driving at night with no headlights. It was the kind of confidence that usually got young flyers killed. Still, Vraciu had his own reasoning. He thought tracers were a bad habit. They gave a false picture. Because they weighed slightly differently than the rest of the ammunition, they did not fly exactly the same at distance. Even worse, they showed the enemy exactly where you were. Every burst of tracers was like lighting a flare that said, "Here I am, shoot back." But the real fight was not only about what he wanted removed. It was about what he wanted instead. He picked up a cartridge with a silver-colored tip. It was the M8 armor-piercing incendiary round. Nasty and unpredictable, it combined the penetrating power of hardened steel with the fire-starting ability of a thrown bottle of fuel. Inside the tip was a chemical mixture that ignited on impact, burning at around 3,000 degrees. It did not just punch holes. It drove a stream of flame through the thin aluminum skin of an aircraft. "I want a hot belt," Vraciu said. "All M8 rounds. No tracers. No plain steel. Only incendiary armor piercers." The chief stared at him as if he had lost his mind. A belt made entirely of incendiary ammunition carried real danger. If a gun jammed and the barrel overheated, those compounds could cook off inside the wing. Vraciu would not only be firing at the enemy, he would be sitting on a set of explosives that could blow apart his own aircraft. The chief tried to explain how heat built up in the guns. He reminded Vraciu that the 50 caliber machine guns were not meant to fire belts like that for long bursts. Vraciu tuned out the lecture. He trusted what he had seen in combat. He understood something about the Japanese Zero that the people writing manuals in Washington did not. The Zero was elegant, quick, and incredibly maneuverable. To make it that light, Japanese designers had removed anything they could spare. That included heavy armor for the pilot and protective lining in the fuel tanks. The American Hellcat, by comparison, was built like a tank. You could put rounds through it all day and the rubber-lined fuel tanks would swell and seal around the holes. The Zero was another story. To Vraciu, it was basically a flying cigarette lighter. If I punch a Zero with plain steel, he limps home, he muttered, voice tight with focus. Air passes through the hole. But if I hit him with this stuff, he does not leak. He ignites. The other pilots thought he was ridiculous. In the ready room, they joked about his obsession with ammunition mixes. You are thinking too hard, they told him. Just get behind them and fire. Stop trying to be a scientist. They said he was meddling in work that belonged to the ordnance crew. Some of them even gave his custom load a nickname, the suicide mix. They warned that his guns would jam on the first attack and leave him flying around unarmed in the middle of a fight. Vraciu let them laugh. Rank did not sway him. Mockery did not slow him down. He kept pushing until the armorer finally gave up, worn down by pure stubborn persistence. The chief threw up his hands and told his crew to load the belts exactly the way the stubborn lieutenant wanted. 6 machine guns, 2,400 rounds, nearly all of them silver-tipped M8 armor-piercing incendiary. No tracers to give him away. No warning lights in the sky. Just unseen streams of fire. Back on the flight deck, the memory of that argument slipped away as he shoved the throttle forward. The engine howled at full power. The shaking in the cockpit grew worse. The Hellcat vibrated so violently that his teeth tapped together. He glanced at the magneto gauges, the ignition system. The needle trembled. The engine was missing. Under normal conditions, he would have pulled power and rolled back toward the elevator for inspection. There was no time now. The radar picture was solid with contacts. The janitor had a job to do. He looked toward his wingman. Around him, deck crewmen sprinted clear, yanking wheel chocks out of the way. The catapult officer dropped his arm, and the steam catapult slammed the Hellcat forward with the punch of a speeding train. Vraciu was crushed into the seat, the acceleration forcing his eyes wide. The fighter tore down the short deck and dropped toward the ocean as it shot off the bow, the weight of fuel and ammunition dragging at it. For a heartbeat, it seemed certain the shuddering aircraft would plow straight into the Pacific. Then the big propeller bit into the thick, humid air. The Hellcat clawed upward. He pulled into a hard climb. Altitude was everything. Height could be traded for speed in an instant, but once lost, it could not be bought back when things went wrong. Breaking through the clouds at 15,000 feet, he found the oil smear across his windscreen had spread. He leaned forward, squinting through a small clear patch along the side just to keep the horizon in view. He flipped his gun switches. He armed the weapons. He imagined the heavy M8 belts curled inside the wings like coiled snakes waiting to strike. The radio snapped with a transmission. The fighter director's voice came through, calm and distant. Vector 270. Angels 20. Many bogeys. Repeat, many bogeys. Vraciu banked left, the vibration rattling through his arms and into his bones. He was effectively on his own. The squadron had scattered in the scramble. He was in a sick airplane with a risky ammunition load, heading toward the biggest air raid anyone had seen. Below him, the ocean looked flat and peaceful. Above him, open sky. But far ahead, dark specks were forming out of the haze. They multiplied fast, like a swarm of insects coming into focus. Not 10, not 20. He counted a group of roughly 50 Japanese dive bombers, with Zero fighters circling as escort. The experts had warned him about his ammunition. The confident crowd had laughed at his special belts. Now Alexander Vraciu was about to see who had been right. He shoved the throttle past its stop into emergency war power. The engine howled in protest. He tapped the instrument panel lightly. "Do not quit on me now," he murmured. "We still have work." Through the greasy canopy, He stared at the approaching mass. It did not look like a neat formation. It looked like a migration. The Japanese aircraft were arranged in layers, a huge, tiered stack of metal and explosives. Down low, torpedo bombers skimmed close to the water. Above them, the Judas, the dive bombers, flew in a loose, uneven pattern that told him plenty about the men flying them. They were inexperienced. New pilots, hovering above, darting back and forth like angry hornets, were the Zeros, the famous escorts that had ruled the Pacific skies for years. There were at least 50 enemy aircraft in that one cluster. One damaged American Hellcat was climbing to meet them. The numbers were so bad they almost seemed funny. Vraciu grabbed a rag and wiped another streak of oil from inside the canopy. The engine kept shaking with a heavy metallic vibration that trembled through the control stick. A cautious pilot would have turned away. A cautious pilot would have looked at that wall of enemy planes, listened to the rough engine, and chosen to live to fight later. Vraciu was not thinking about bravery. He was thinking about efficiency. He studied the loose formation and did not see an unbeatable threat. He saw opportunity. The Japanese crews flew straight and level toward the fleet, as if on a routine trip. They trusted their numbers to keep them safe. They believed no lone American fighter would be foolish enough to attack a group of 50. They were wrong. Vraciu eased back on the stick and climbed higher. He wanted the sun at his back. In a dogfight, sunlight was the only camouflage that mattered. With the sun behind you, you became nearly invisible. With the sun at his back, the glare would wash out his outline and blind enemy gunners. Vraciu kept climbing until he reached 24,000 feet, the supercharger clattering loudly, and settled high above the Japanese formation. From up there, he felt like a hawk on a wire, staring down at a yard full of easy prey. He chose his first victim, a Judy dive bomber drifting a little loose on the left edge of the group. The pilot inside was likely young, maybe 18 or 19, working hard just to stay in position through the rough air. Vraciu tipped the Hellcat's nose forward. The heavy fighter dropped fast, like a safe shoved out of a window. The airspeed needle spun upward, 300, 350, 400 knots. The shaking of the airframe eased, replaced by the sharp, steady howl of wind over the wings. This was the real test, not of his flying, but of his ammunition. The armorer had warned him. The so-called experts had laughed and said the M8 incendiary rounds were too light, that they would tumble in flight and fail to punch through. If they were right, he would only throw sparks off the enemy's skin and then get shredded by dozens of angry gunners. If he was right, something very different would happen. He closed in, 2,000 yards, 1,000. He still held his fire. Inexperienced pilots often panic and start shooting from far out, wasting rounds into empty sky. Vraciu waited. He needed to be close enough to make it count. At 600 yards, the Judy filled his sight. He could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy. Vraciu squeezed the trigger. He did not spray. He tapped it, a short, tight burst that lasted less than a second. The effect was instant and brutal. Normal .50 caliber ammunition usually left neat holes, with a trail of gray smoke as fuel or coolant leaked out. Vraciu's special load did not just puncture. It struck the wing root, where the fuel tanks sat. The M8 rounds tore through the thin metal and ignited as they hit. There was no slow leak, no warning. A violent bloom of orange flame burst outward. The Judy did not simply fall. It came apart. One moment it was an airplane. The next it was a spinning fireball cartwheeling toward the ocean. The flash was so bright Vraciu saw it reflected on his own instruments. The critics had been wrong. The armor had been wrong. The M8s were not unstable junk. They were devastating. They turned his guns into throwers of fire. Vraciu did not slow down to watch. Speed meant survival. He used the dive's momentum to zoom back upward, trading speed for altitude, climbing back toward the sun before the Japanese gunners could even figure out where the attack had come from. Behind him, the formation rippled in confusion. They had seen one of their planes explode, but they had not seen the attacker. Heads were turning, crews scanning for a whole squadron, a pack of fighters. They did not realize it was one man in a sick airplane with a bad attitude. Vraciu rolled inverted and dove again. Second target. Another Judy, this one flying tighter in the middle of the group. A tougher shot. If he missed, he would blast through the formation and end up right in front of the Zeros. He lined it up, ignoring the shaking, ignoring the oil smear on the glass. He trusted his gear. He trusted the belt. He came down from above at about 400 miles per hour. This time the rear gunner saw him. A stream of small 7.7mm rounds snapped past his canopy, like glowing insects. Vraciu did not twitch. He did not dodge. He waited until the Japanese aircraft filled his view, then fired another short burst, maybe 70 rounds in total. The incendiaries marched along the fuselage like a cutting torch. They struck the engine. The magnesium in the M8 tips ignited the oil. The front of the bomber disappeared in a sheet of blinding white flame. The propeller tore free and spun away into the blue like a tossed toy. The bomber jerked upward, rolled over, and dropped, leaving a thick trail of black smoke that traced Vraciu's path across the sky. 2 aircraft destroyed in less than 2 minutes. He pulled up again, his engine protesting loudly. He checked his ammunition counters. He had barely used any. He had downed 2 planes with fewer rounds than many pilots burned just testing their guns. The Janitor was cleaning up. But now the surprise was gone. The hive had been kicked. The Zeros above rolled into dives, trying to catch the unseen attacker. They knew he was somewhere near the sun and searched the glare for a shape dropping again. Vraciu spotted them, the square-tipped wings of Mitsubishi fighters easy to recognize. These were not the slow dive bombers. These were the real threats, agile, quick, and furious. And they were making a mistake. He watched their turns and studied their movement. They were not smooth. Their turns were wide. They lost formation too easily. These were not the seasoned pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor. Those men were gone, lost over Midway and Guadalcanal. These were replacements, young flyers with barely enough hours to handle their planes, much less fight an experienced Hellcat pilot. As they banked to come after him, they showed him their undersides. They were giving him a clean shot. It was a deadly error. The Zero pilots approached like this was some kind of formal duel. They expected the American to circle, twist, and play the usual dogfight game. Vraciu had no interest in a dance. He was there to finish targets. He picked out one Zero that had drifted away from the others, trying to get in front of him and block his escape. The Japanese pilot hauled his nose up, trying to hang on the propeller for a firing angle. For a brief moment, the fighter stalled, frozen in the air, pale against the sky. Vraciu stomped on the rudder and shoved the Hellcat's nose down. He was not retreating. He was charging straight in. He dropped toward the Zero, wind shrieking over the canopy, oil streaking his view, engine clattering. He steadied the sight on the stalled fighter. The Japanese pilot realized too late what he had done. He tried to roll away, but the laws of motion were not on his side. Vraciu pressed the trigger. The hot belt fed smoothly. The incendiary stream hit the Zero at the wing root. The aircraft had no self-sealing tanks, no armor to speak of. It was light metal and fuel, like lighting a match in a fuel-soaked room. The Zero came apart. It stopped looking like an airplane and started looking like a bursting flare. Burning fragments of metal drifted downward toward the sea, joining the wreckage already falling. 3 enemy aircraft destroyed in about 3 minutes, and Vraciu was only getting started. As he pulled out of the dive, heavy G-forces pushing him into the seat, a shadow slid across his cockpit. He glanced up. The rest of the Zeros were no longer confused. A dozen of them were diving straight at him, dropping like a steel avalanche. He was alone, low on energy, and his engine shook so hard the instrument panel blurred. The easy shooting was done. Now would be a fight. Vraciu did not waste energy on fear. Fear is for pilots with altitude in reserve, and he had already spent most of his. Behind him, a pack of Zeros came down for revenge, while ahead the mass of Japanese bombers still pushed toward the American fleet. Many pilots in that spot would make a simple choice. Turn and try to dogfight the Zeros, which would likely end badly, or dive away and run for safety. Vraciu picked a different solution. He chose geometry. He understood something about his Hellcat that the Japanese did not. The F-6F was heavy. Compared to a Zero, it weighed as much as a loaded truck. In a climb, that weight was a drawback. In a dive, it turned into raw energy. Vraciu shoved the stick forward. The Hellcat did not glide downward. It dropped like an anvil. The airspeed shot past 400 knots, the structure groaning. The Zeros tried to follow, but their lighter airframes began to tremble and flutter at that speed. They could not match the falling weight of the American fighter. Vraciu hauled back hard, pulling out of the dive with brutal force, grayness creeping into his vision as blood drained from his head. He used the speed he had built to swing underneath the Japanese bomber formation. It was a hunter's move. By sliding directly below them, he made their own aircraft his cover. The Zeros above could not fire without risking hits on their own dive bombers. He had turned their numbers into a problem. Now he was the fox under the flock, and the farmer could not shoot without killing his own birds. Target 4 cruised directly overhead. Another Judy, its belly exposed, plodding along at about 200 knots. Vraciu pulled the nose up. He was coming from directly below, a blind angle where no gunner could see him. His engine vibration was worse now, a steady pounding that rattled everything in front of him. He had to be careful with his bursts. He closed in. 300 yards. 200. He tapped the trigger. The special load went to work. M8 incendiaries tore into the bomber's belly tank. There was no slow fire. The fuel vapor inside the tank ignited all at once, like a bomb going off. The center of the Japanese plane burst outward. Vraciu yanked the stick left to avoid a rain of burning metal dropping toward him. He did not watch the wreck hit the water. He was already searching for another target. The Japanese formation was coming apart. Discipline was fading. Pilots looked down and saw fire and smoke, but they still could not see the attacker striking from below. They began to weave and drift, breaking their overlapping fields of fire and making his job easier. Kill number 5 demanded steady nerves. The next Judy pilot spotted him. This one did not freeze. He rolled hard, trying to throw off Vraciu's aim. It was a smart move, but Vraciu did not aim where the bomber was. He aimed where it had to be. He kicked in rudder, skidding sideways to lead the target like a hunter on a fast bird. He held the trigger a bit longer, around a second and a half. The line of silver-tipped rounds walked into the engine cowling. Magnesium flared bright white. This time the blast did not stay under the enemy aircraft. It came straight toward him. The Judy exploded less than 100 yards ahead. A sudden cloud of smoke, flame, and jagged debris filled his entire view. There was no room to turn and no time to think. Vraciu clenched his jaw and flew straight into the fireball. For a brief instant, everything around him turned orange. Debris rattled against the wings like handfuls of gravel thrown at a metal roof. The Hellcat trembled as it punched through the burning cloud and burst out the other side, his windscreen now coated with a fresh smear of soot and oil. He glanced at the wings. They were dented, paint scorched, but still there. The engine kept coughing and shaking, yet it continued to run. The Janitor was still working. 5 down. Behind him, the sky was dotted with parachutes, drifting like pale jellyfish toward the ocean. There was no time to count them. He looked up. The Zeros were enraged now. They had left the bombers and were diving at him from every direction, determined to kill the lone American who had wrecked their strike. They came high and low, from both sides, tracers flashing past his canopy in the bright sunlight. Vraciu tuned them out. His focus narrowed to a single task. One more bomber lagged behind the group, struggling to catch up. The pilot was pushing his engine hard, black smoke trailing from the exhaust as he tried to reach the safety of the formation. Vraciu cut across the corner and shoved the throttle through the gate, ignoring the temperature needle buried in the red. The Pratt and Whitney howled, burning fuel at a frightening rate as the battered fighter crept closer. 100 yards. 50. He was close enough to see the rivets along the Judy's tail and the rear gunner wrestling with a jammed weapon. Vraciu felt no hesitation. This was not personal. It was arithmetic. Him or the fleet. He pressed the trigger again. The guns thundered for a heartbeat and then went quiet, not from a jam and not from empty belts. There was simply nothing left to shoot at. The M8 rounds ripped the tail clean off the bomber. The aircraft snapped apart in midair. The nose section tumbled forward while the rear spun away, and the pilot was flung into the slipstream. 6 enemy planes destroyed in roughly 8 minutes. Vraciu checked his watch and then his ammunition counters. He had fired around 360 rounds, roughly 60 bullets per aircraft. The experts claimed it took 1,000 rounds to bring down a bomber. They said tracers were necessary to aim. Vraciu had just shown that a filthy windscreen, stubborn confidence, and a belt full of incendiaries could do the job. But the fight was not finished. A new sound filled the cockpit, the heavy thump of anti-aircraft fire. He had chased the enemy so far that he had flown into the defensive fire zone of his own fleet. Below, The ships of Task Force 58 were firing everything they had. Black bursts from exploding shells filled the sky. They were aiming at the Japanese, but they had no idea an American fighter was in the middle of it. To nervous gunners below, he was just another speck that might be a threat. A 5-inch shell burst near his right wing. The shockwave tossed the Hellcat like a toy. Fragments clanged against the fuselage. Vraciu swore. He had survived dozens of enemy planes only to be nearly taken out by friendly fire. He banked sharply, showing his underside to the ships, trying to make his silhouette clear. "Do not shoot," he shouted into his mask, though no one below could hear. "I am on your side." He dove low, skimming the water at 300 miles per hour, getting beneath the bursts and the guns. Then he turned toward the Lexington, home. The rush of adrenaline drained away, leaving a deep, heavy exhaustion. His hands trembled on the controls. Sweat soaked his flight suit. The cockpit smelled of burned powder and fear. He keyed the radio. "Lexington, this is Vraciu. Returning. Get the deck ready." The controller's voice came back, sounding stunned. They had watched the radar and seen enemy contacts vanish one by one. "Roger, Vraciu. Deck is ready. What is your status?" He glanced at the gauges. Fuel nearly gone. Ammunition still partly full. Smoke trails stained the distant sky. "Status is good," he said, his voice a little rough. "But tell the armorer to line up more of those silver-tipped rounds. I found a good use for them." He lowered the landing gear. One wheel dropped cleanly. The other hesitated before locking down with a thud. The flaps whined into position. The engine sputtered, running on fumes. He lined up with the deck of the Lexington, a small strip of steel in a wide blue ocean. He had to land this shaking, oil-streaked machine without smashing into the island. He eased back the power. The Hellcat settled toward the deck. The tailhook caught a wire. The harness bit into his chest as the aircraft slammed to a stop. He was down. He was alive. He slid the canopy open and pulled in a breath of sea air. It tasted clean and sharp. He unbuckled and rose in the cockpit. Deck crew ran toward him, not cheering yet. Their eyes were on the airplane. They stared at the soot, the dents, the oil streaks. Vraciu pulled off his helmet and looked at the men gathering near his wing. He spotted the armorer, the same chief who had argued with him about the ammunition belts. The chief was staring at the gun ports, dark with soot but barely warm. Vraciu gave him a small grin. The smile that spread across his face was uneven and worn, but it was genuine. He lifted his hand without speaking and held up 6 fingers. The famous photograph came about by chance. A Navy photographer's mate, likely just searching for a clean shot of the ship's structure, noticed the small crowd forming near the edge of the deck. A pilot stood on the wing of a battered Hellcat, surrounded by sweaty, excited mechanics. The flyer looked drained. Oil streaked his face. His flight suit was soaked through, and his eyes carried that distant look that comes after hours of staring at death. The photographer brought up his camera. "Hey, Alex," someone called out. Vraciu glanced over. He did not strike a pose. He simply flashed a wild grin still buzzing with adrenaline and held up 6 fingers. That image, the pilot with 6 raised fingers, would become one of the defining photographs of the war in the Pacific. It ran in newspapers across the United States, a symbol to families back home that the tide had turned. But the real story was not in the photograph. It was unfolding just a few steps away, inside the Hellcat's gun base. The armorer, the same chief who had once argued with Vraciu, opened the access panels in the wings. He expected burned-out barrels and ruined guns. Instead, he saw something that made no sense at all. The ammunition belts were still heavy. He pulled them out and began counting what remained. The numbers did not add up. Vraciu had shot down 6 enemy aircraft, a mix of bombers and fighters, and still returned with most of his rounds unused. "How?" the chief asked, looking up while wiping grease from his hands. "You hardly pulled the triggers." Vraciu climbed down from the wing and lit a cigarette, his hands still trembling. "I told you, Chief," he said, smoke drifting around his tired face. "I did not have to tear them apart. I just had to set them on fire." The so-called janitor's load was no longer a joke. It was proof. Vraciu had shown that in the speed and confusion of air combat, accuracy mattered more than volume, and fire mattered more than flash. Ignoring conventional wisdom had kept him alive. The teasing stopped that day. The jokes vanished. Suddenly, Every pilot in the squadron wanted to know the exact mix he had used. They all wanted what became known as the Vraciu belt. The man they had mocked as a janitor had just cleaned the sky, and he had done it with less ammunition than many pilots wasted on practice bursts. That day, June 19th, 1944, became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American forces downed more than 400 Japanese aircraft. It was one of the most one-sided air battles ever fought. The Japanese naval air arm was shattered in a single afternoon and never truly recovered. At the sharp end of that blow was Alexander Vraciu, the pilot who refused to follow the book. But wars do not last forever. The rush fades, the engines go quiet, and the men who lived in that world of speed and fire faced the hardest mission of all. They have to return to ordinary life. Vraciu ended the war as the Navy's fourth highest scoring ace, credited with 19 confirmed victories. He was decorated and respected. He could have stayed in the spotlight, written memoirs, toured the country, or sold his story to Hollywood. That was not his way. Vraciu thought of himself as a craftsman, not a celebrity. When he took off the uniform, he put his wartime experiences away and closed that chapter. He moved to California. He became a banker. Consider that for a moment. The man who once dove into a swarm of enemy aircraft and changed the rules of aerial gunnery spent decades behind a desk, approving home loans and checking interest rates. The people who sat across from him saw a quiet, friendly man with thinning hair and an easy smile. They had no idea that the same hand signing their paperwork had once fired bursts that turned enemy planes into falling flames in the space of minutes. He rarely talked about his combat days. He did not boast. He did not argue with history. If someone mentioned the turkey shoot, he would shrug and say he had simply done his job. He shifted the credit to mechanics, to the ship, to other pilots. He refused to act like a legend. He preferred to be a regular neighbor. But the legend did not fade just because he wanted it to. In naval aviation training, instructors still discuss the Vraciu curve, the discipline of closing to very short range before firing. They stress the control it takes to hold fire until you can see the enemy clearly. They remind young pilots that equipment matters, but instinct can matter more. They teach that sometimes the sensible approach fails, and the crazy-sounding idea is the one that works. Alexander Vraciu died in 2015 at 96 years old. He passed away quietly in his sleep, long removed from the roar of a Hellcat engine or the smell of burning metal. But look again at that photograph. Look at the grin. Look at the oil on his face. That is not the expression of a banker. That is the expression of someone who stared at the impossible, grinned, and then set it on fire. We share stories like this not to celebrate destruction, but to remember creativity under pressure. We tell them because history often overlooks the troublemakers. It keeps track of generals and admirals, the leaders who pushed symbols across maps. It forgets the junior officers who changed the way their guns were loaded. It forgets the ones who stepped outside the manual because following it would have gotten them killed. Alexander Vraciu was told his idea made no sense. He was warned his methods would get him killed. He was advised to keep quiet and fly the standard way. If he had obeyed, the USS Lexington might never have come home. But he trusted his own judgment. He filled his guns with incendiary rounds, attacked from the sun, and demonstrated that the line between insanity and brilliance is often drawn by the outcome. We hold on to stories like his so that Alexander Vraciu does not fade into the background noise of history. We keep the signal going. If you found this look at the mechanics behind history interesting, tap the like button. It helps more people who care about the details discover these stories. Subscribe for more accounts of the people who bent the rules and changed the course of the war. I will see you in the next one.